Hi, everyone. We'll just give people a few minutes to join. We see a lot of people kind of joining as we're speaking, so we'll wait a couple minutes and then get started. Thank you. Great. Well, I think we've got a bunch of attendees and more people trickling in, but we can get started. So thank you so much for coming to our webinar series, Navigating Market Access with Magnolia. Today, we're going to be talking about using real-world data in vaccine safety with focus on signal detection and confirmation for market access stakeholders. So, next slide. So today, you'll be hearing from myself. I'm Jessica Duchin. I'm the Vice President of Real World Evidence and HUR Strategy. Mike Murphy, who is Director of RWE and HUR Strategy here at MMA, and Benny Turner, who is a Director of Real World Clinical Insights. And just a brief agenda, we'll go through a quick introduction and then discuss real-world data sources in vaccine safety studies. We will take a look and discuss stakeholder perspectives and then methods to assess real-world vaccine data, and then conclude with a discussion of real-world applications, future trends, and then some time for Q&A. Next slide. Great. So looking at the critical role, vaccines are a cornerstone of our public health. The first vaccine was introduced in the late 1790s against smallpox. And the smallpox vaccine is perhaps our most successful vaccination campaign in US history, with the eradication of smallpox in the 60s and 70s. And vaccines prevent disease, eliminate and control outbreaks, and ensuring vaccine safety is critical for public trust and for public health. Importantly, vaccines save money and reduce healthcare costs by preventing infections. They prevent direct medical costs, reduce the use of long-term care and antibiotics, reduce outbreaks, and increase productivity by reducing work absenteeism and school absenteeism. A 2020 analysis found that for every $1 spent on childhood vaccinations, the US saves nearly $11. And public trust is an important component of vaccine uptake and stability of our public health system. Trust in vaccines increases vaccine uptake, especially in the context of rapid vaccine development, which we've seen over the past couple of years, reduces the spread of misinformation, and supports the ongoing innovation and development of vaccines and drugs. Great. Next slide. Great. So what is real-world data? Real-world data includes health-related data that's collected outside of traditional clinical trials and includes things like electronic health records, which we'll refer to primarily as EHRs or EMRs, insurance claims, including medical and pharmacy claims, patient registries, and then increasingly patient-reported outcomes. And the real difference is that while clinical trials are controlled and essential for drug and vaccine approval, real-world data provides greater insights into vaccine performance outside of a clinical controlled setting and provides information on safety in broader and more diverse populations over time. And when we think about the role of real-world data in vaccine safety, it really allows us to detect rare or long-term adverse events. And we can do this earlier with signal studies and helps us to assess vaccine effectiveness across subgroups that might not have been included in clinical trials, and then further supports regulatory and public health decisions. And the goal of our presentation here is to explore how leveraging real-world data can enhance vaccine safety monitoring, discuss key methodologies, and then review some case studies demonstrating the real-world impact of the use of real-world data in vaccine safety monitoring. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike to discuss different real-world data sources that can be used in vaccine safety monitoring.
Thanks, Jess. So first, just a little bit about why we need real-world data for vaccine safety. Clinical trials, as Jess talked about, are generally considered the gold standard, but they do have important limitations, and we need real-world data to fill those evidence gaps. For starters, real-world data sources have diverse populations that are understudied in clinical trials. For example, many vaccine trials exclude pregnant women. Clinical trials are also expensive and logistically complex. It's not usually feasible to recruit enough patients to detect rare adverse events or to follow up patients for long-term safety outcomes. And finally, real-world data can give researchers more flexibility to do comparative safety and effectiveness studies than would be feasible in the clinical trial setting, particularly for subpopulations of interest. And these studies can inform public health recommendations and clinical decision-making. The first step in vaccine safety surveillance using real-world data is signal detection. And the goal here is to identify potential safety issues as early as possible. This has both passive and active components. With passive surveillance, we're looking for unusual patterns or unexpected adverse events that might suggest a novel risk. These systems rely on voluntary reporting from healthcare providers, vaccine manufacturers, and the general public. In the US, the CDC maintains the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, which we'll get into a little more detail on in a minute. And globally, the European Medicines Association maintains the EudraVigilance database, and the World Health Organization has their version called VigiBase. Active surveillance systems, on the other hand, are more focused, either on a specific vaccine of interest, such as newly introduced vaccines, subpopulations of interest like high-risk groups, or defined safety concerns that may have been detected from other databases, such as VAERS. They make use of existing real-world data sources such as insurance claims, electronic health records, or registries. And public health authorities have established networks like the Vaccine Safety Data Link and the Sentinel initiative that can aggregate real-world data sources for more powerful analyses than would be possible in a single source. These networks are resource intensive to establish and maintain, but they can provide for near real-time monitoring of vaccine safety, and they can be used to study many different vaccines and outcomes. So VAERS is the main passive surveillance database in the US. It was established in 1990, and it's jointly managed by the FDA and the CDC. Anyone can go online and submit a case report. In the middle of the slide there, you can see a screenshot of part of the form you would fill out. And this is arguably both a strength and a weakness of the system. The fact that it is open to reports from anyone gives it broad reach, and the data are timely because reports can be submitted as soon as an adverse event is suspected. So this allows VAERS to function as a sort of early warning system. And you don't need a pre-existing hypothesis about the relationship between the vaccine exposure and the outcome. Anything that happens after a vaccine is administered is potentially reportable. But on the flip side, the system has a lot of limitations. It is prone to both underreporting and biased reporting. And while VAERS does conduct follow-up into reports of death and some other unusual reports, generally events that are reported into the database are unconfirmed. And finally, there's no denominator data in order to calculate rates or comparison group to assess relative risk. But despite these limitations, the database does have real value, especially when data mining and Bayesian techniques are employed to address some of the shortcomings of the data. And probably the biggest success story was in the late 1990s when a new rotavirus vaccine was introduced in the US. About 9 months after the vaccine was introduced, a signal for a bowel obstruction condition was detected in VAERS, and confirmatory research led to that vaccine being taken off the market. But there have also been controversies. Notably, some reports of autism after vaccination were discovered to have been submitted by personal injury lawyers seeking to generate evidence to be used at trial. And case reports from VAERS were used to spread misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccines. Finally, in 2004, there was an infamous case where a doctor who was seeking to prove a point about the validity of VAERS reports, or lack thereof, submitted a report that a vaccine turned him into the Incredible Hulk. Now, this report was accepted into the database, but a VAERS representative did follow up to contact the doctor, and he agreed to withdraw the report. The Vaccine Safety Data Link is an active surveillance system, and it's one of the most important ones for vaccine safety in the US. It was established in 1990, and it's a collaboration between the CDC and healthcare organizations across the country. 11 sites provide electronic health record data on over 12 million patients, and 2 additional sites provide subject matter expertise without contributing data. By combining data from sites across the country, the VSD has a large and diverse data set, and the EHR data is clinically rich, giving longitudinal data on healthcare visits, vaccines administered, and health outcomes. The VSD employs what they call rapid cycle analysis, where the data is analyzed on a weekly basis to assess if rates of predefined adverse events are elevated in the vaccinated population compared to unvaccinated controls. And when this occurs, follow-up analysis may be conducted. VSD researchers have also done innovative work to develop and validate algorithms to define pregnancy and electronic health records, and to link mom-baby records to look for long-term outcomes of vaccines received by pregnant women. One drawback of the VSD, though, is that all of their data come from managed care organizations, so it's possible that these patients may differ from the general population in terms of things like socioeconomic status, health behaviors, or access to healthcare, which could result in selection bias or limit the generalizability to non-MCO populations. And while the VSD employs sophisticated analysis techniques with high-quality data, it's still a signal generation resource, and findings need confirmatory studies. A few examples of the real-world impact of the VSD. When the H1N1 vaccine was introduced in October 2009, VSD employed rapid cycle analysis and was able to report in early December that no safety signals were detected. So just to highlight that in safety surveillance, sometimes not finding a signal can be just as important as finding something if you have enough data to quickly and reliably conclude that a vaccine is safe. It can increase public confidence in newly deployed vaccines. And in the same vein, each year, VSD conducts rapid cycle analysis of the flu vaccine with a special emphasis on pediatric, elderly, and pregnant populations. Finally, I do just want to highlight an example where a signal was found. For children aged 12 to 23 months, VSD found an increased risk of febrile seizure for the combined MMR and varicella vaccine compared to the MMR and varicella vaccine separately. This finding was validated by a manufacturer-sponsored study, and as a result, the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices changed their recommendation on those vaccines. The last active surveillance system I want to talk about is the Sentinel initiative. This is really the premier surveillance system for all medical products in the US. It was established by FDA in 2008, and to date, it has 1.3 billion person years of data, with over 125 million patients currently accruing new data. And within Sentinel, two systems are specifically geared towards vaccine safety, PRISM and BEST. They're able to employ Sentinel's large and diverse data sets, which include claims, EHR, and registry data. And the size of the data gives these systems more power to detect very rare adverse events. Researchers are also able to employ advanced statistical methods to control for confounding, even in the signal generation phase. And the data can be assessed rapidly, allowing for near real-time monitoring of vaccine safety. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of resources go into building and maintaining these networks. Integrating and analyzing diverse data sets requires technical infrastructure and expertise. And a lot of resources also go into data governance and security to ensure privacy and compliance. In terms of real-world impact, I just wanted to highlight some findings from analysis of the COVID-19 vaccines. They provided important data on incidence rates of myocarditis and pericarditis after the mRNA vaccines, particularly in young men, and on TTS after the adenovirus vector-based vaccines, particularly in older women. These analyses contributed to updated risk-benefit assessments and guidance on the timing and type of vaccines in different demographics, as well as recommendations for enhanced post-vaccination monitoring in these populations. They also assessed allergic reactions such as anaphylaxis after the COVID vaccines and found them to be rare and generally manageable with appropriate medical attention. So a limitation of active surveillance is that signals need to be confirmed. Regulators can require manufacturers to conduct post-market safety studies after a signal is detected, and manufacturers may collaborate with regulators on these safety assessments, and together they can develop risk mitigation strategies, or depending on the findings, these studies could lead to labeling changes or even recalls or vaccines being withdrawn from the market. For a confirmatory study, you would want to develop a full protocol-based epi-study to assess the causal relationship between the vaccine exposure and the adverse event of interest. And this could be a cohort design, a case control design, or a self-control design where you compare the periods before and after vaccination within the same individuals. You might employ claims, EHR, or registry data that will have detailed and accurate information on the vaccination and health outcomes. And this may involve chart review to confirm the electronic health records. The data sources will also need to have sufficient clinical detail on potential confounding factors, and statistical methods like propensity scores might be used in these analyses. So just to recap, signal detection and signal confirmation are distinct phases in vaccine safety surveillance that have different data needs. In the signal detection phase, we're monitoring for unusual patterns or clusters of adverse events, and timely data is critical to provide early warning of potential safety problems. There's an emphasis here on broad coverage to detect rare events and a focus on subpopulations of interest. Clinical details and confirmed outcomes may be less important here because the causal relationship will be evaluated in the signal confirmation phase. And then in the signal confirmation phase, we don't necessarily need the same sort of massive data set that we need in the signal generation phase, particularly if we're using a case control or self-control design. Instead, we want a data source that has more clinical detail, including good information on potential confounding factors, and confirmed outcomes are key here, which is why these studies may need to involve chart review. So now I'm going to hand it over to Benny to discuss different stakeholder perspectives on real-world data in vaccine safety.
Great, thank you. So we've talked a lot about kind of the flow or the life cycle of vaccine safety surveillance. So that signal detection to validation to kind of the ongoing monitoring. We're going to take a step back now and talk about the who behind the what. So really everyone cares about vaccine safety, right? These are just some stakeholder groups that I've kind of put together to illustrate differences in kind of how they approach the vaccine safety conversation, what sorts of data needs they have, especially in terms of real world data and real world evidence. So if we start kind of over on the left, in regulatory agencies, these are folks that are using real world data for things like post-marketing surveillance, risk benefit assessments. They're trying to support vaccine approvals and or label expansions as that kind of comes up. They're also doing things like identifying disparities in kind of your vaccine access and your outcomes from vaccines. They're trying to decide on kind of funding justification, right? Where are we allocating our dollars, and what makes sense in terms of buckets for us to put research money into. The FDA, EMA have increasing reliance on real world data to supplement or maybe even replace traditional studies in some cases. They really care about robust data quality and transparent methodologies because these are the folks that are kind of governing everything, right? They're trying to keep the entire public safe, and well treated. They're also guiding vaccination strategies. So if there's, for instance, when the COVID vaccine first became available, there was some population prioritization that went on. So the FDA sat down and decided, okay, who's the most at risk? How do we prioritize those patients, and how do we justify the prioritization of those patients? Especially in terms of emergency response efforts. Moving to the right, we've got your public health authorities. So we're looking at folks like the CDC, the World Health Organization. These folks are leveraging real world data for population level monitoring and real-time risk communication. So they need rapid signal detection and response systems, similar to VAERS, which Mike covered. Their emphasis is going to be on timeliness, scalability, and integration with other surveillance systems. So maybe they're kind of needing that data a little quicker. Payers and health technology assessment bodies. These folks are going to be concerned with long-term safety and cost effectiveness of vaccination programs. Their interest in real-world data comes from the value assessments, pricing, reimbursement, formulary decision justification, those kinds of things. So they're interested in the safety, definitely, and also the cost, whereas your regulatory agencies are less focused on cost and more focused on safety. Moving again to the right, we've got vaccine manufacturers. They're using real world data to monitor product performance, inform their label uptakes, support regulatory submissions if they're, submitting for a label expansion, those sorts of things. They need clear standards to ensure acceptability of the real world data analyses by regulators and payers. So they're trying to make sure that their evidence is as transparent as possible and as replicable as possible to make the case to regulators and payers that their data is valid, scientifically strong, et cetera. For healthcare providers or HCPs and health systems, their value access is going to be up-to-date safety data to inform clinical decision making. So they're complementing their clinical trial data with real-world data on safety to offer insights into vaccine performance. They're also looking at kind of what's the population diversity. And as we know, your clinical trials typically lack a population diversity. They usually focus on a really specific subset of the population. So your HCPs and health systems are thinking more broadly about how does this apply across the patients that we are seeing and treating every day, and how do we guide personalized patient recommendations to ensure that we're being as kind of safe and also as safe and kind of aggressive as possible for treatment of whatever they're currently tackling. So they're supporting evidence-based decisions on vaccine scheduling. They're also looking at prioritization. So if they have a certain resource of vaccines, how do we prioritize that across the population that we are treating? And then they obviously contribute to the real world data sources because they're providing the electronic health record information. They're also doing safety reporting, kind of looking at, are there any adverse events that they're seeing pop up, and reporting those back into manufacturers, et cetera. Then lastly, we have the patients and the public. The patients and public obviously have really high expectations for transparency and communication about vaccine safety. There's some hesitancy there, or some maybe distrust of the medical system, particularly in certain populations, that needs to be addressed. And so they're looking at, can I understand the information that's given to me, and also can I trust that information? So they're, we're looking at, like I said, addressing vaccine hesitancy, particularly in the patients who are part of populations that would be underrepresented in the clinical trials. So if someone's looking at clinical trial data and looking at the patient population and saying, well, that completely doesn't match me at all, how will this affect me personally? So they're going to go to real world data to kind of see that more broad, diverse population. They have a role in contributing to the real world data as well in terms of passive reporting systems. Again, the VAERS that Mike reviewed earlier. And so the key takeaway here, I guess, is there are lots of stakeholders. There's a high importance for collaboration, data sharing, and alignment of incentives across those stakeholders to improve both the safety surveillance itself through the real world data, and also the communication of that safety surveillance and outcomes. Next slide. Perfect. If you could just tap it once more. Perfect. So if we think about the kind of spectrums of needs in terms of vaccine safety data and real world data, there's your population level, all the way to individual, right? So how is this functioning amongst the 10,000 patients in a particular city versus how is this functioning for me personally? And then on my kind of y-axis here, I have the breadth of kind of data timeliness. So is this a retrospective or periodic review, or do I need data that is very real time, very relevant, very new, right? And so again, looking at those same stakeholder groups and thinking about kind of what their needs are on these two spectrums as they interact with each other. In the top left, we've got your population level data and real-time data. So here we've got your public health authorities. They need early signal detection. They need outbreak alerts. So they're using surveillance networks like VSD, dashboards, et cetera, to kind of monitor that as it's ongoing so that they can intervene early if there is an issue. Moving to the right, looking at the top right, this is individual level data and in real time. This, I've grouped here clinicians and health systems, or HCPs and health systems. So they're looking for alerts for individual risk. Are there any vaccine contraindications that they should know about as they're kind of administering vaccines to their patients? Here they're using tools like EHR integrated alerts. So if they're in their Epic system and it pops up and says, hey, wait, this patient has a contraindication for this vaccine. They're also using clinical dashboards. So then moving down, but staying on the right, we've got the bottom right, which is individual level and retrospective data, or maybe a little older data. This is going to be your manufacturers and payers. So they need patient level case studies, cost risk stratification, things of that nature. They're going to rely on that more unstructured data, so from things like chart reviews, in combination with your claims data, your pharmacovigilance reports, those sorts of things to kind of integrate into their own decision making at their level. And then if we move to the bottom left, that's going to be your population level and retrospective or periodic review of data. And here we have regulators and HTA bodies. These folks need causal analysis. So they want to know, what is the population level risk benefit for this vaccine, for implementation of this vaccine. So they're going to be using tools like retrospective cohort analyses, comparative effectiveness data, things like that, that are kind of looking at what's the effectiveness in broader populations in order for you to kind of make those coverage decisions. So if we go next, we'll actually go into some methods. So I mentioned comparative effectiveness, which might, I don't know, make no sense to you yet. But if we think about kind of the life cycle of surveillance and that we've reviewed, so kind of being a funnel, right? So you've got your signal detection at the top, which translates into or moves into your signal validation, refinement, et cetera, and then your ongoing monitoring. If you think of the data sources as a pyramid, or the methodologies as a pyramid, right? At the bottom, you would have that descriptive studies. So this is going to be your widest base. It's going to give you information around frequency, trends, and kind of who, where, and when things are happening. So this could provide that signal detection, like, hey, we're seeing in this particular population, this AE pop up. And that's kind of going to give you just the broadest picture of what's happening. Your middle layer would be your analytic studies, so where you're looking at risk estimation, associations, those sorts of things. And then your top layer, or kind of the narrowest chunk of that pyramid, is going to be the comparative effectiveness and safety methodologies. These are looking at head-to-head comparisons, benefit risk balancing. So to talk to each of these in a little bit more detail, your descriptive studies are going to characterize patterns, trends, and frequencies of health outcomes. They're not testing causal relationships. They're just providing that foundational insight into potential public health issues. So common types of descriptive studies include kind of your case series, your cross-sectional surveys, population surveillance reports, things like that. These are going to detect those early warning signs of potential adverse events post-vaccination. And they're going to provide just, a little bit of data into potential direction for the future signal validation, right? So then if we move into analytical studies, these are going to be more specific. There'll be things like cohort studies, case control studies. They're going to be their strength is in establishing the association between the vaccine and the outcome. So we saw this potential outcome in our descriptive. We're now saying we believe there is an actual association here. So here we're testing hypotheses that we have generated based on descriptive studies. And then we're aiming to quantify the risk and determine causal relationships. Here, some things that matter are going to be providing robust evidence on whether a vaccine is linked to that adverse event. helping to distinguish true signals from random variation or kind of background noise or rates, and then controlling for confounding variables and biases common in observational data. Next, your top of the pyramid, your comparative effectiveness research, is going to inform vaccine performance across different populations. So here we're looking to address bias and confounding factors again, but on a more specific level. We're evaluating how different interventions work in real-world settings. We're comparing the benefits and risks of medical treatments, including vaccines, and then we're focusing on, again, those diverse populations, diverse healthcare settings, and long-term outcomes. Yeah, so then if we move into the next slide, we'll kind of take those methodologies and start looking at how they're applied to each of those pieces of kind of the signal life cycle. So we'll start with signal detection. This, again, is kind of the foundational step in vaccine safety surveillance. This is your first warning sign to say, hey, something could be wrong here, right? So the signal is referring to an unusual pattern, potential safety concern that appears more frequently than we're expecting after a vaccination. It could be something entirely new, or it could be a known adverse event that's occurring at higher rates than we would expect. Importantly here, detection does not equal confirmation. So this is the start of the process. The signal should become then a hypothesis, which promotes deeper investigation, which will funnel into the later stages of kind of this life cycle. If you're thinking about methodologies that we would use for signal detection, there's things like disproportionality analysis, again, used in systems like VAERS or others. We're looking at whether adverse events are being reported more often than we'd statistically expect for a particular vaccine. We can look at things like reporting odds ratio, proportional reporting ratio, and even Bayesian confidence propagation neural network to help us kind of quantify those differences, flag disproportionate patterns, things like that. Here, AI can play a huge part, right? Because the one thing that we know AI is really good at time in and time out is taking a large amount of data and kind of filtering through it for noise. So if you think of AI applications in signal detection, there are kind of two separate and distinct AI functions we could use here. The first being the kind of predictive analytics of AI, right? So if they're taking in this large amount of data, are there any signals that they're seeing that maybe would take longer to pick up on manual review? And then the second piece of kind of the AI involvement here is going to be in that natural language processing. So looking at that unstructured data and synthesizing it and saying, hey, I'm actually seeing this term pop up time and time again, or at a higher rate than I would expect. So that's kind of how AI can be used. Obviously, still, it's really important that there be manual review because AI is not completely to be trusted yet, although it does a great job. There is still that human touch, that expert clinical review that remains essential. So because algorithms can't replace that human judgment, we often rely on structured case assessment frameworks like WHO-UMC or the Brighton collaboration criteria to validate signal plausibility and look for causal clues. The outcome of all of this is a more informed and data-driven approach to safety. So as I said prior, the signal, once detected, becomes the basis for further investigation. We kind of take that nugget and we move on to the next part of the life cycle. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so here I'll address kind of the middle chunk, which is a lot of different phases in one. We're looking at signal validation, refinement, and evaluation, right? So here, we're specifically saying, okay, our safety signal popped up in our signal detection phase, and then what do we do with that signal? We then move into kind of the validation and refinement, saying, okay, is this signal real? Let's look at it a little bit. Let's turn it over, see what's kind of behind this. Is it statistically and clinically meaningful, or is it just noise that we're seeing in the data? Once we assess, yes, we think this is real, yes, we think there could be some clinical meaning to this, then we would move on to evaluation, which is determining whether the signal could truly be causal. So establishing that relationship and saying we feel good that treatment, or in this case vaccination, is causing this signal. So is the vaccine likely responsible for the adverse event? When we're looking at methodologies here, we're starting with descriptive epidemiology. So we're slicing the data by age, sex, geography, time. We're looking for patterns, clusters, and then we kind of move into the self-controlled designs. We're thinking about things like each person obviously acts as their own unique individual. So we're kind of looking at the individual and saying, okay, can we eliminate some of the confounding variables that are playing into this potential signal from their fixed individual characteristics? Here we can use things like cohort studies. We can do some propensity score matching, which is taking patients from kind of multiple populations and matching them across characteristics that they share or have in common. And then we can make vaccine recipients and non-recipients kind of comparable as much as possible. For rarer events, we can use things like case control studies nested within large databases. We can also lean on things like quantitative bias analysis to test how sensitive our results are to unmeasured confounding or misclassification. And then obviously the linked data sources. So can we pull from the EHR, which is your system like Epic, and also link that to kind of the claims data, and also is there registry data we can pull in? Are there specific immunization systems data that we can pull in to get that more complete picture of what's happening with patients? The outcome of kind of this large chunk of the life cycle is more refined and reliable understanding of risk. So we're able to estimate here how big the risk is, when it tends to occur, and who might be most affected in the population. So this work would directly inform those regulatory decisions that help identify where labeling or recommendations need to be updated, and then most importantly provides the public with the reassurance that we're continuously assessing vaccine safety with both rigor and transparency. And then if we go to the next slide, we will talk about ongoing monitoring. So we're kind of just taking the information that we have now validated, that signal we have now validated, and we're just doing continuous safety monitoring. So looking at things like long-term confirmatory studies after a vaccine is authorized to see if there's any new signals being detected, how the previously detected signals are kind of shaking out and appearing in the data, things like that. So when we look at methodology, we're looking at active surveillance systems. Again, this is linking those kind of EHR with the claims data, maybe even some patient-reported outcomes to create that real-time view of what's happening in the population. Examples of that would be like the FDA Sentinel initiative. And then we can look at sequential monitoring to allow us to perform kind of repeated analysis as data accrues while we're controlling for false false positives that can happen if you're testing the data too often. So rolling cohort designs let us continuously enroll and track new vaccine recipients, which is especially important when booster programs roll out or when new populations become eligible. Maybe we've expanded the kind of sample of folks who can receive a vaccine. We're relying heavily on longitudinal observational studies. So we're tracking outcomes over time, looking for recurrent patterns, modeling time-varying risks, confounding factors, things like that. The outcomes of this are kind of detecting the emerging risks earlier, confirming and ruling out previous signals, like I said, that have been pulled in, and then making informed decisions about vaccine use in different population groups, including special populations or in response to evolving viral variants. So we're supporting here the timely policy updates. We're building public confidence by showing that vaccine safety is being monitored and obviously acted upon kind of long after the initial rollout, right? We didn't just set it and forget it. So next I'll turn it over to Jess for some case studies.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I thought we could finish up by just discussing some case studies where we can see, the real world application of signal detection to confirmatory studies, and then how that has affected policy and vaccine recommendations. So the first example is looking at Dengvaxia and severe dengue. Dengvaxia is a vaccine, produced by Sanofi. It was first approved in 2015 for people who had for children who had either previously had a dengue infection or had lived in a highly endemic dengue area. The interesting thing about dengue, which is important for this discussion, is you actually need to be infected with dengue multiple times to get severe disease. So the first time you get bitten by the vector, you don't really get sick. And then it's the second infection that is the more severe with higher morbidity and mortality. So originally, observational data, primarily out of the Philippines, found an increased risk of severe dengue infection in children who had been vaccinated, but didn't have previously documented exposure to dengue. And that's primarily came from surveillance data and real world data out of the Philippines, because the Philippines enacted a school-wide vaccination program. So they tried to vaccinate all of the school-age children within the Philippines. And then follow-up confirmatory studies by Sanofi and then other independent investigators using long-term follow-up and retrospective cohort studies confirmed that this signal was real and that the vaccine should only be used among individuals with prior dengue infection are the only ones that should receive vaccination. And consequently, the WHO, CDC, and other government organizations across the world, including in the US, updated their recommendations and strongly advised pre-vaccination screening for dengue exposure before vaccination. And this also led to ongoing monitoring and evaluation, primarily led by the manufacturer, which has recently found that the vaccine actually has a protective effect longer than 6 years, which is a great outcome for a vaccine protecting from an infectious disease. In the next slide. And then we touched a little bit on this one, and I know this is always probably more top of mind given the past couple of years, but with the COVID-19 vaccines, there was an original signal detected of elevated rates of heart disease or myocarditis and pericarditis among younger males who had received the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, which we refer to as Moderna and Pfizer. And these data came from VAERS, VSafe, BSD, and then international data surveillance of the WHO, and then European data. And then confirmatory studies were done, including self-controlled case series in the UK and Israel, retrospective cohort studies using the vaccine safety data link, matched case control studies, as well as time series and surveillance analyses, and did find that myocarditis is rare, but it is more common in males under the age of 30 within 1 week of their first mRNA dose, and occurred more frequently with them during a vaccination. And again, this led to just updated public health guidance and updated vaccination guidance, and informed this like dose spacing that the first and second vaccine should be separated by X number of weeks. And that was really important for preventing this rare outcome. And has also led to ongoing monitoring and safety studies. Great. Next slide. And then just thinking through, what are the future trends and where we can go with innovation in vaccine safety monitoring using real world evidence. And a couple of areas for opportunities include AI and machine learning for signal detection, which we've touched on a little bit, but using natural NLP models and predictive analytics to identify subtle or emerging safety concerns in these large data sets. Global data integration, which would be a movement towards harmonized international data platforms such as the WHO Vigibase or Access, which would support cross-border and international signal verification, particularly during vaccines or global vaccine, during pandemics or global vaccine rollouts. Another focus would be real-time patient-generated data, which could be done using mobile apps or wearable devices and patient-reported outcomes to monitor post-vaccine effects, which would be especially helpful in monitoring those more moderate or subtle side effects that you get from a vaccine that might not, warrant a full report to one of these systems, but are something that a lot of patients are experiencing. Enhanced data linkage and interoperability is another area of opportunity by improving integration of EHRs, claims, and immunization registries for more comprehensive surveillance. Kind of thinking, if you get a flu shot at Walgreens, a lot of times that doesn't show up in your, Epic MyChart or when you're meeting with your primary care doctor. So how do we encourage that sort of, data linkage and collaboration? Broader use of pragmatic and hybrid trials, which would embed safety surveillance within real world clinical trials and more adaptive study designs, which would blend the scientific rigor of an RCT with the larger generalizability of real world data. Personalized safety monitoring, like using genomics or demographics and health history for an individualized risk profile, kind of like similar to what Benny was mentioning about, your Epic chart or your EHR flagging you as someone who's maybe at risk for a side effect or a great candidate for a vaccine. And then finally, further integration of equity and subpopulation analyses, emphasizing the use of RWD, real world data, to monitor vaccines safety across diverse populations that are often not included in clinical trials. Such as pregnant women or older or younger individuals, which would also help to identify disparities in adverse events. And the bottom line is that real world data can increasingly drive proactive, personalized, and globally connected vaccine safety monitoring, which will continue to transform how vaccines are integral to public health in the future. Great. And then next slide, we just wanted to leave some time for questions if anyone had any. Great, well, here's one that's come in. How does the data quality from VAERS compare to more structured systems like EHRs when it comes to early signal detection?
Yeah, I can take that one. So, with VAERS, there's an opportunity to report things like comorbid conditions that a patient may have, but a lot of times those aren't part of the data submissions. And also the outcomes are not necessarily as reliable as you might find in an EHR. Whereas with the electronic health records and claims, you've got a defined time period that you're observing the patient. You've got, data on their health history potentially. So you can control for confounding factors, which you can't do really in VAERS case reports. And so, to use the VAERS data well, you need to do, more sophisticated data mining and Bayesian techniques, whereas in the EHR data, you can kind of do the sort of straightforward observational analysis that we're used to with those kinds of data sets.
Great, thank you. And then another question, how do payers typically weigh real world data against randomized controlled trial data when making reimbursement decisions?
I can take that. So if you think of kind of from the payer perspective, they're not looking to replace the randomized clinical control data with real world data. They're definitely relying on RCTs and prioritizing that data, especially at initial decision, right? Initial coverage decision. They're going to really heavily look to the randomized clinical trial or randomized control trial in terms of establishing their own policies on it. Once the kind of approval happens and we're post-launch, then they're going to start complementing that RCT data with real world data and looking at how is this performing, what are the cost impacts, things like that. So the two data sources, I guess, answer different but still important questions for them, which RCTs are kind of saying, does this treatment work under the ideal conditions? And then your real world data is coming in behind that and saying, okay, does it work in the real world? And is it worth the cost?
Thanks, Benny. And then I think we have time for just one last question regarding kind of methodologies and comparative effectiveness research, saying what methodologies are most effective in addressing biases and confounding factors. And I can take that one. So increasingly we see the importance of propensity score matching when we use real world data sources, whether it is propensity score matching on demographic characteristics and clinical characteristics, or using IPTW or high dimensional propensity score matching, which has been used very frequently among childhood vaccinations and looking at neurological outcomes, where you can control for hundreds of different confounding factors that would be present in the EHR. Those are really important methods. Great. Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. And if you go to the next slide, we can highlight our next webinar next month, focused on how the Congressional Budget Office can improve its methodology to use to score healthcare legislation, and you can join us for that on Thursday, May 22nd. Thank you.